Sleepy summoner, close your eyes and listen as a gentle story unfolds across the darkened sea. This is not a tale of sharp angles and sudden shouts, but a soft recounting of a life shaped by waves and whispers, by love and loss, by revenge and responsibility. It moves at the pace of the tide under a calm night sky where stars drift slowly and the moon plays on quiet water. You are invited to drift with it, letting each word wash over you, soothing the edges of your thoughts. Our story follows Sarah Fortune, the woman Bilgewater knows as Miss Fortune. Her life began in the glow of a forge and the scent of salt. It carried her through the smoke of burning wood and the acres of night terrors. It set her on a path of vengeance and ultimately led her to become a protector and leader. Through it all, the sea has been her constant companion, a dark mirror reflecting pain and promise. Tonight, we will journey through her memories as if they were dreams, pausing to feel the warmth of childhood, the sting of loss, and the steadying touch of purpose. The world of Runeterra is vast and filled with clamour, but here, under the watchful eyes of constellations, it becomes a cradle for reflection and quiet courage. Sarah's earliest memories were bathed in the amber glow of her mother's forge. The workshop sat on a small, salt-kissed island off the coast, a place where the crash of waves beat a steady rhythm beneath the ringing of hammer on iron. When she was very young, her world consisted of polished wooden floors warm from the hearth, iron filings glittering like tiny stars, and the gentle murmur of her parents' voices. Her mother, Abigail Fortune, was renowned throughout Bilgewater and beyond for her mastery of firearms. Men with coin and status came from distant coasts to commission her bespoke pistols, each weapon a blend of artistry and lethal intent. Her father, steady and kind, kept the accounts and soothed customers with cups of spiced tea while Abigail worked. For Sarah, the forge was more than a place of business. It was a sanctuary and a school. She learned to count by sorting brass casings into neat piles, and she learned patience by watching her mother file a trigger until it moved like silk. She loved the smell of gun oil and the way a completed pistol felt balanced and precise in her small hands. Abigail taught her to respect the power contained within a weapon, reminding her that every shot had a consequence and that craftsmanship carried responsibility. There were many evenings when Sarah fell asleep to the soft brush of her mother's file and the warm hum of her father's lullabies, wrapped in a blanket that smelled faintly of smoke and iron. When dawn painted the world in pale colors, she woke to the calm certainty that she was loved and safe. Among the many commissions that passed through Abigail's hands, none were as significant as the pair of pistols she crafted for her daughter's future. They were designed quietly over long months, assembled late at night when the forge was otherwise still. Each metal piece was shaped with exceptional care, and each brass plate was engraved with curling patterns reminiscent of the swirling sea. Abigail envisioned them as an extension of Sarah's own hands, lighter and shorter than most, yet sturdy and reliable. As Sarah watched the progress of these weapons, her admiration for her mother's skill deepened. She could see love in the symmetry of the barrels and in the way the walnut grips were polished to a smooth sheen. Abigail taught Sarah how to file wheel locks, how to measure powder, and how to set trigger pulls that would never fail. Together they cast custom shot and carefully tested each mechanism. When the pistols were complete, Abigail placed them on a cloth and let Sarah pick them up. The metal was cool, and the balance was perfect. Sarah's fingers curled around the grips, and she felt a strange tingling sense of destiny. She did not yet know what trials would come, but she understood that these weapons were more than tools. They were heirlooms infused with skill, devotion, and the hope that they might keep her daughter alive in a world of shifting tides. The island settlement where Sarah grew up was small enough that she could walk its perimeter in the time it took the sun to climb from the horizon to the top of the sky. The narrow paths were lined with worn stones, and there were always gulls circling overhead, their cries a kind of constant conversation. Fishermen mended nets while children chased each other among crates, laughing and squealing. Barrels of salted fish and rope coils perfumed the air with a tang that Sarah would always associate with home. In the evenings, when the sea calmed and turned to glass, villagers gathered around driftwood fires to swap stories of legendary leviathans and far-off lands. The flicker of flames danced in their eyes, and Sarah watched those tales weave themselves into the shadows. Her own contributions to the nightly gatherings were small, a question here, a giggle there. But she listened closely. Through these stories, she learned that Bilgewater was not just a place. It was a world unto itself, a place of risk and reward where fortunes were made and lost in the span of a tide. She learned of the Reaver King Gangplank, who ruled the city with cruelty and fear, and of the brave or foolish souls who dared to defy him. These names were distant, almost mythic. Her life on the island felt protected, removed from the violence whispered about in the shadows. Nevertheless, when she lay in bed at night, Sarah sometimes imagined what it might be like to stand on the wharf and smell the city's smoke and salt. She did not yet understand that the sea does not recognize the boundaries humans draw. One day, the waves would bring Bilgewater's wrath to her very door. The night the sea carried danger to their home began much like any other. Stars glittered above, and the air was cool and heavy with the Idar, scent of rain waiting beyond the horizon. Sarah sat at the table with her parents, giggling over a story her father told about a customer who had tried to pay with clams instead of coin. Abigail laughed, wiping her hands on a cloth, the flicker of candlelight illuminating the fine lines at the corners of her eyes. There was comfort in the simple routine of washing dishes and banking the coals for the night. When a heavy knock echoed through the shop, it sounded like any other customer arriving late. Sarah's father opened the door to a group of men cloaked in darkness. Their leader, whose face was hidden beneath a grimy scarf, stepped forward and demanded the pistols Abigail had been crafting. Sarah recognized his voice, though it was coarser than before. He was Gangplank, the ambitious reaver she had heard about in stories. He had once come to the forge like a man of means, eyes full of calculation, but now there was violence in his stance and greed in his tone. Abigail refused him. She stood firm, telling him that these guns were not meant for him, that their workmanship and lethality were beyond anything he deserved. There was no negotiation. Gangplank's eyes narrowed and his men drew weapons. In the chaos that followed, everything Sarah knew burst apart. Her parents were cut down by bullets fired from the very pistols her mother had made. Gangplank's laugh was harsh and cold as he turned the guns on the family that had refused him. Flames rose quickly as he threw torches among the tools and powder. Wood and oil caught, and thick smoke filled the air. Sarah felt searing pain as a bullet grazed her side and the heat of the fire licked her skin. For a moment, the world blurred into cries, crackling flames, and the clatter of spilled tools. Then she was alone among ruin, clutching the shattered remains of her mother's pistols to her chest as the workshop burned around her. Sarah's escape from the burning forge was desperate and slow, each movement laden with pain and fear. Splintered beams groaned overhead, and acrid smoke stung her eyes, but she focused on the cool weight of the pistol fragments in her hands. Crawling across the scattered debris, she found a gap where the wall had fallen and wriggled through, gasping fresh air as she tumbled onto wet sand. The night breeze was like a balm, cool against her blistered skin, but every breath brought the metallic taste of blood and soot. She looked back once, seeing the flames consume the only home she had ever known. There were no more laughs inside, no more whispered songs. Tears blurred her vision, mingling with ash on her cheeks. Neighboring villagers, drawn by the blaze, carried her away from the collapsing workshop. They pressed cool cloths to her wounds and murmured words of comfort that did little to soothe the storm inside her. For many days she drifted in and out of feverish sleep. When she woke, night terrors seized her, and she relived the moment of her parents' deaths again and again. The smell of smoke clung to her hair, and phantom heat licked at her skin. Yet even in those dark moments she clutched the broken pistols, feeling the grooves her mother's hands had carved. They became her talismans, anchoring her to the memory of love and to the resolve that would soon take shape in her heart. She swore to rebuild them and to seek justice for what had been taken from her. Time heals, but it also hardens. As Sarah's physical wounds closed, leaving pale scars across her ribcage and shoulder, the wound inside her began to crystallize into purpose. She took the battered pieces of her mother's pistols to a neighbor skilled in metalwork and convinced him to let her use his tools at night when the shop was quiet. She spent countless hours filing and shaping, coaxing the misaligned parts back into harmony. She replaced springs and forged new barrels from salvaged metal, whispering apologies when a slip of the file marred a surface. Her hands grew calloused, her fingertips blackened with soot and oil. Each small success, a pin seated perfectly, a trigger that clicked into place, soothed her nightmares. Rebuilding the pistols was only part of her preparation. She taught herself to shoot with accuracy and speed, practicing on empty beaches where only gulls witnessed her determination. She lined up driftwood planks and broken bottles, learning to control her breathing, to squeeze the trigger rather than yank it. There were mornings when her arms ached from the recoil, and evenings when the weight of grief pressed her to her knees. But she continued. She remembered her mother's lesson that every shot has a consequence. In her mind, each bullet she fired during those lonely sessions carried a piece of anger, each shard of frustration leaving the muzzle in a plume of smoke. Slowly, she became proficient. The twin pistols, though scarred and etched with new engravings, felt like natural extensions of her hands. They would be the instruments of her vengeance, but they were also the last tangible connection to her parents. She vowed never to let them go. Years passed, and the girl who had crawled from a burning workshop grew into a woman with hair like flame and eyes like still water. The stories she had heard as a child about Bilgewater's twisting alleys and cutthroat docks now drew her, not out of curiosity, but out of resolve. She boarded a creaking merchant vessel bound for the port city, standing at the prow as the island faded into mist behind her. Sea spray dampened her face, and the wind tugged at her hair, but she felt the steady weight of her pistols beneath her coat. Each mile that the ship cut through the water brought her closer to the man who had stolen everything from her. When she arrived at Bilgewater, the city assaulted her senses. The stench of fish and tar merged with the sweetness of exotic spices. Shouts and laughter erupted from taverns while sailors sang bawdy songs. Markets bustled with traders hawking their wares, and the clangor of shipyards echoed against steep cliffs. Above it all hung a mist of smoke from oil fires and cooking stoves. Sarah's childhood imagination had not done the city justice. It was both more vibrant and more grim. As she stepped on to the crooked timbers of the quayside, she tightened her grip on her pistols. She had one purpose: to hunt the man who had declared himself the Reaver King of Bilgewater. She would first learn his city, then find his men, and finally, when the time was right, she would bring Gangplank to his knees. Sarah did not waste time making herself known. On her first night in Bilgewater, she walked past the raucous taverns and the bleary-eyed sailors to the bounty board nailed to a salt-warped post near the docks. The wooden planks were thick with parchment, each notice bearing the likeness of a wanted man or woman, along with a sum of silver serpents. She scanned the faces until one name caught her eye: a drunken pirate with a gallon of Myron's dark in his belly and a price on his head. It was not a large bounty, but it was enough to mark the beginning of her campaign. She tore the notice free and tucked it into her pocket. Finding the pirate was easy. He stumbled out of a tavern and into the street, singing off-key and waving a knife. Sarah stepped into his path and, with a voice as calm as the sea before a storm, informed him of the bounty. He laughed, swinging his knife in a sloppy arc. Before the knife could come close, she drew her pistols and shot twice. One shot hitting his hand, sending the knife flying, and the other grazing his shoulder to spin him around. As he staggered, she closed the distance and slammed the butt of her pistol into his jaw. He fell, unconscious, bloodied but alive. Sarah dragged his heavy body down the wharf, past gawking onlookers, and delivered him to the officials at the bounty board. She received her coins with a small nod, then turned and walked away, leaving whispers in her wake. Within days, stories of the red-haired woman with twin pistols began to circulate through taverns and gambling dens. Some said she shot like a mermaid queen. Others claimed she never missed. A few remembered her from the island forges and recognized the pistols as Fortune's craft. They called her Miss Fortune, at first in jest, but the name stuck like tar. Those with warrants out for their heads began to watch the shadows more carefully, and some left the city entirely rather than risk crossing paths with the new bounty hunter. Sarah's reputation grew, and, with it, her access to information. She learned which taverns Gangplank's men frequented, and which alleys served as shortcuts to his strongholds. Every night she laid another foundation stone in her plan for vengeance. As weeks turned into months, Miss Fortune's work grew more ambitious. Each name she crossed off the bounty board was a step closer to her true target, and each corpse or captive she dragged to the harbor sent a message. She drowned, The leader of the Silk Knife Corsairs, in a barrel of her own stolen rum after cornering her in a claustrophobic gambling den. The woman had tried to buy her way out of the confrontation with promises of gold and loyalty, but Sarah knew better than to trust hollow oaths from a cutthroat. With quiet, steady hands, she pushed the struggling captain's head beneath the dark, sticky liquid and held it there until the bubbles stopped. Then she walked away, leaving the corpse for the corsairs to find. Another hunt took her deep into the slaughter docks, where the insane doxy ripper made his lair in the belly of a half-dismembered leviathan. The giant beast's carcass, suspended by chains and pulleys, creaked in the damp air. Gulls and rats feasted on the exposed ribs, and the smell of rot was thick enough to taste. Sarah navigated the labyrinth of catwalks and ropes with care, listening for the madman's mutterings. When he lunged at her from a pile of hides, brandishing a hook and cackling, she stepped aside and fired. The bullet pierced his shoulder, and before he could recover, she kicked the rope that held a massive hook. It swung through the air, catching him in the chest and pulling him backward off the platform. He fell with a scream, landing hard on the docks below. Sarah took aim and shot him in the back as he tried to crawl away. She left his body there, a warning to others who thought to hide among the dead. Through acts like these, she cultivated an image of unpredictable ruthlessness. Those who underestimated her faced a beguiling opponent with an uncanny ability to turn their arrogance against them. She was careful to temper violence with strategy, making sure that each action served her larger goal. When she took control of a ship called the Siren from its beleaguered captain, she did so not only to command a vessel, but to secure a mobile base from which to operate. The captain had refused her initial offer of a fair exchange, drawing on his reputation instead of reading the resolve in her eyes. He learned the hard way what it meant to spill a hand when it wasn't wanted. After the takeover, she renamed the ship the Siren and began to assemble a crew of her own. No captain commands the tides alone, and Misfortune understood that to challenge Gangplank and survive, she needed more than skill with pistols. She needed allies she could trust. Her choice of crew members was deliberate. She recruited sailors who had been wronged by Gangplank's reign, men and women who had lost family members to his cruelty or had been cheated out of their earnings. She took on Rafin, a wiry man with a shark's grin who possessed an uncanny ability to turn rival gangs against one another. She enlisted a former cartographer who knew every hidden cove and current around Bilgewater, and who could draw maps in his sleep. She welcomed a quiet woman named Ithaca, who could disassemble and reassemble a musket faster than most people could blink. Each person she added brought not just strength, but a personal stake in toppling the Reaver King. Together, they transformed the Siren into a symbol of defiance. They reinforced the hull, installed hidden compartments for weapons and supplies, and hung lanterns that could be shuttered or revealed to signal allies on shore. On deck, Sarah drilled her crew in the art of swift boarding and silent night raids. She taught them the value of timing and restraint, emphasizing that their purpose was not to sow mindless chaos, but to systematically dismantle Gangplank's network. In the dim light of the hold, they whispered strategies and shared intelligence, building a camaraderie forged by shared purpose rather than idle revelry. Misfortune also forged alliances beyond her immediate crew. She bartered information with smugglers who knew gangplank supply routes, and she struck bargains with tavern owners in exchange for sanctuary and safe passage. She even reached out to Twisted Fate and Graves, two thieves whose reputations for deception and gunplay were nearly as notorious as her own emerging legend. Though they had no love for authority, they had grievances with Gangplank that she could exploit. These alliances were fragile, built on mutual need rather than trust, but Sarah navigated them with caution and charm. Every connection she made tightened the net she was weaving around her enemy. Planning Gangplank's downfall required patience and precision. Misfortune knew that killing him outright would not satisfy the debt she owed her parents. He had to lose everything he prided himself on: his ship, his reputation, and his control of Bilgewater. She gathered information about his movements, his loyal crew called the Jagged Hooks, and the rhythms of his operation. She learned when the Dead Pool, his flagship, was most vulnerable, docked for resupply in the heart of the harbour where everyone could see. She gathered her crew and allies in the Siren's hold and revealed her plan, speaking softly over the creak of timber and the hiss of lanterns. Her words held no fiery declarations, only a clear, steady determination. On the chosen night, they moved like shadows. Rafen and his team infiltrated the Dead Pool under the guise of hired deckhands, carrying clay pots filled with blasting powder disguised as cargo. Twisted Fate slipped through the crowd, dealing marked cards to distract those who might become curious. Graves positioned himself on a nearby rooftop with a rifle to cover their escape. Sarah waited in a dinghy, her pistols resting on her lap, watching the moored vessel's hull rise and fall with the tide. When the last pot of powder was placed deep within the belly of the ship, Rafen signaled her with a small lantern flicker. Misfortune's heart beat calmly as she took aim with a single shot. She raised her pistol, feeling the familiar weight and the memory of her mother's hands guiding her. Her finger tightened on the trigger, and the bullet flew across the water, striking one of the powder pots. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. Then light flared from the Dead Pool's hull, followed by a roar that shook the harbour. Flames leapt into the night sky, and the ship shuddered. Explosions blossomed along its length as the hidden powder ignited in sequence. People on the docks screamed and ran. Others stood frozen, faces lit by orange fire. Gangplank's flagship cracked and began to sink, her masts tilting like dying trees. In the chaos, Sarah's crew slipped away, their work done. The following morning, as smoke still curled above the water, rumors spread. Some said Gangplank had died in the blast. Others whispered he had survived, clinging to wreckage. Regardless of the truth, his aura of invincibility shattered. Misfortune watched from the shadows, her expression unreadable. She had achieved what she set out to do. She had humbled the man who once slaughtered her family, and she had let the entire city witness his fall. The image of the Dead Pool in flames was branded in the minds of Bilgewater's inhabitants. They now looked to a different captain for leadership, one who had orchestrated the impossible and who might steer the city through the storms to come. With Gangplank gone, at least for a time, Bilgewater descended into a different kind of chaos. Rivals who had cowered under his rule seized the opportunity to fight for control. The narrow streets echoed with clashes between gangs, and the stench of smoke from burned warehouses lingered over the harbour. Innocent townsfolk were caught in the crossfire, and the tenuous peace that had existed dissolved like foam on a cresting wave. Misfortune watched the unfolding violence with a heavy heart. She had fulfilled her vow of vengeance, yet she understood that her actions had opened a void that ruthless men and women were eager to fill. Reluctantly, she stepped forward to impose order. As captain of the Siren, and as the woman who had brought down the dead pool, she commanded respect and fear. Backed by her loyal crew and the alliances she had forged, she brokered an uneasy truce among the warring factions. She met with leaders at neutral taverns under the watchful eyes of armed guards, her tone measured and uncompromising. She reminded them that a city at war with itself could not fend off threats from the sea or from Noxian marauders. Slowly, grudgingly, agreements were struck. Zones were delineated and bloodshed decreased. Even so, misfortune knew that nothing in Bilgewater was permanent. Power shifted as easily as sand under a tide, and there were always those who plotted in the shadows. She accepted that she had traded one form of conflict for another. Where once her focus had been narrow, the death of a single man, it now expanded to encompass the well-being of an entire city. She did not relish the responsibility, but she shouldered it, believing that without some measure of order, the place she had come to hate and to love would tear itself apart. The real battle for Bilgewater, she realized, had only just begun. In the month that followed, misfortune found herself growing into an unexpected role. She had become a judge and enforcer, a negotiator and occasional executioner. She walked through markets and was greeted with nods of respect rather than whispers of fear. She dined with captains who had once cursed her name, and she stood on the cliffs above the city, watching the horizon for threats. The weight of her pistols at her hips was a familiar comfort, but it was accompanied now by the weight of decisions that affected hundreds of lives. In quiet moments, she wondered if her parents would recognize the woman she had become. Sometimes she caught glimpses of herself in dark water and saw shadows of the girl who had giggled at her father's jokes. The fiery thread of vengeance that had driven her for so long now mingled with threads of compassion and caution. She had tasted revenge, and though it had been bitterly satisfying, it had not brought her the peace she had imagined. Instead, it had laid bare the complexity of justice in a place like Bilgewater. Gangplank's end had freed people from his tyranny, but it had also released forces she could not control. Sarah learned that true power was not in pulling a trigger, but in steering a course through impossible currents without losing her sense of self. She took solace in small rituals. She cleaned her pistols every night, wiping away salt and powder, reminding herself of her mother's meticulous movements. She walked the decks of the Siren at dawn, breathing in air still damp with mist, listening to the creak of rigging and the distant call of seabirds. She sat with her crew, sharing stories and laughter, allowing herself to feel a connection to others rather than the isolation that vengeance had imposed. Through these quiet acts, she found balance, a sense of moving forward while honoring the past. One morning, as the sun painted the waves in gold, a towering figure strode down the docks toward Misfortune and her crew. Eloi, the priestess of the bearded lady, carried with her a heavy stone idol and a presence that commanded attention. Her colorful robes contrasted with the weathered wood and grey smoke of the wharf. The men and women accompanying her were armed, but their eyes held no hostility. They were followers of a goddess who prized motion and growth. Sarah watched Ilaoi approach, curious about what this formidable woman wanted. They spoke briefly about Jackknife Burn, a fallen pirate Sarah was preparing to sink in his own cannon as a final farewell. Ilaoi, munching on a mango with unhurried ease, offered a blessing for the dead man, then turned her gaze to Misfortune. In a voice like rolling thunder softened by mirth, she told Sarah that she was not stupid, but that she did not yet understand what she had done. Ilaoi spoke in metaphors about razor eels and the danger of letting motion be consumed by obsession. Then she held out a pendant carved from coral, its surface warm from her touch. Sarah hesitated, but the eyes of the gathered crowd compelled her to accept. She looped the leather thong around her neck and felt the pendant's weight settle against her chest. Though Sarah did not fully believe in the bearded lady, she respected the priestess's wisdom. Ilaoi reminded her that victory, however satisfying, was only a single step along a greater path. There would always be another tide, another threat, another test of resilience. The pendant became a reminder of that truth. It sat against her skin, warmed by her own body heat, and its presence grounded her when decisions felt overwhelming. It was a symbol not of faith in a god, but of faith in the idea that life was movement and that stagnation, whether through grief or complacency, invited decay. Bilgewater's uneasy calm was broken one night when thick black fog rolled over the water with unnatural speed. Bells rang frantically across the city, and shutters slammed shut as townsfolk dusted strange symbols on doorways. Misfortune stood in her villa, the one she had taken from a gang leader slain during the early days of the power struggle. She loaded her pistols and laid them on a table beside her sword, listening to the rising panic outside. She knew what was coming. The harrowing, a night when the black mist from the Shadow Isles swept across the sea and brought with it the restless dead. In defiance of the danger, she left her shutters open, daring the spirits to face her. The room grew cold as unnatural winds whispered through the open windows, carrying a chill that sank into bone. She ran a fingertip along the curves of the coral pendant Ilaoi had given her, feeling its warmth even as the temperature dropped. Rafen entered without knocking, his face grim, and behind him stood a score of her fighters armed with muskets, wheel locks, and bundles of clay bombs. They were ready to follow her into the darkness. The black mist hit the docks like a wave, spilling over ships and streets. Spirits emerged from its depths, their forms twisted and glowing with eerie green light. Some were monstrous amalgamations of horses and armored knights. Others were slender, robed figures whose voices carried echoes of ancient lamentations. The dead clawed at the living, dragging sailors into the freezing water, tearing rigging from masts and shattering planks with supernatural strength. Misfortune led her crew into the fray, pistols blazing. Each shot of her twin guns burst through spectral forms, dispersing them in clouds of green fire. Her fighters hurled bombs that exploded with blinding light, buying precious moments of relief. She moved through the chaos with calm precision, shouting orders and anchoring her people's courage with her own. Amid the battle, Sarah felt something shift inside her. In the face of this unearthly threat, her quest for personal vengeance seemed small. The harbour that had once been a stage for her revenge was now a battlefield where the living fought against oblivion. She realized that leadership meant standing between her people and the darkness, not just avenging a past wrong. The harrowing lasted through the night, waves of mist and spirits battering the city, but when dawn finally crept over the horizon, the black mist retreated. The survivors stood exhausted but alive among the wreckage. Misfortune holstered her pistols with hands that trembled not from fear, but from the enormity of what she had just protected. The city would never be the same, and neither would she. In the days after the harrowing, Bilgewater resembled a wounded animal licking its wounds. Broken ships lay half sunken in the harbour, their masts protruding at odd angles. Nets hung torn from piers, and blood stained the cobblestones where men and spirits had fought. Families counted their dead, and priests of the bearded lady walked among the survivors, offering comfort and counsel. Sarah walked the docks with Rafen and Ithaca, assessing damage and listening to stories. People whispered thanks and disbelief when she stopped to speak with them, their eyes wide with respect. Many had not expected to live through the night, yet here they were, alive because someone had chosen to stand when others would have run. That choice haunted Sarah, not because she regretted it, but because of what it had revealed to her. She had discovered a capacity within herself for selfless courage that she had not anticipated. The weight of leadership, once accepted reluctantly, had fused with her identity. She understood that as long as she drew breath, she would be responsible for this city and its people. Revenge would no longer be enough to define her. The pendant at her throat seemed heavier now, as if it absorbed the grief and gratitude around her. It reminded her that life was movement, and that she could not afford to let bitterness root her in place. On quiet nights after the harrowing, Sarah would sit on the roof of her villa and stare at the horizon. The sea was indifferent, its waves continuing their eternal rise and fall as if nothing had happened. Stars glittered above, and sometimes a gull's cry drifted on the breeze. She thought of her parents, imagining them walking along the shore of some peaceful afterlife, proud of the path she had chosen. She thought of Gangplank, somewhere nursing his wounds and plotting a return. She thought of the Shadow Isles and the mysteries that shrouded them. She did not know what future tides would bring, but she knew she would meet them head-on, pistols ready, heart steady. Years later, when the black mist returned in force and stories of the ruined king's awakening spread, Misfortune found herself at another crossroads. A strange alliance formed in Bilgewater, bringing together champions whose paths might not otherwise have crossed. Ilaoi, who had become a trusted confidant, spoke of visions and omens, of a storm brewing far worse than any harrowing before. Braum, the cheerful yet indomitable warrior from the Freljord, arrived with news of ice and shadows creeping across the northern seas. Yasuo, a swordsman haunted by his own past, came seeking redemption. Ahri, a fox spirit with enigmatic motives, and Pike, a harpoon-wielding killer returned from the dead, joined the group as if pulled by the gravity of destiny. Sarah did not welcome the idea of leaving her city, but she saw that Bilgewater's fate was intertwined with the mysteries of the Shadow Isles. The black mist's source lay there, and if it was not confronted, it would continue to surge, growing stronger with each cycle. After ensuring that her crew and trusted lieutenants could maintain order in her absence, she boarded a ship bound for the haunted islands. The voyage was long and fraught with danger. Oily tendrils of mist tried to creep aboard at night, whispering in languages forgotten by the living. Spectral lights danced on the water, and once a hulking undead leviathan surfaced nearby, its hollow eyes glowing green. Braum's laughter and Ahri's stories helped keep fear at bay, while Yasu's music on a bamboo flute soothed frayed nerves. Upon reaching the shores of the Shadow Isles, Sarah felt the weight of despair that hung over the land. Trees twisted into unnatural shapes, and the ground itself seemed to exhale sorrow. The group fought their way through hordes of restless spirits, each battle a test of endurance and will. Misfortune's pistols flared again and again, bursts of orange muzzle flash in a world of green gloom. She learned to pace her shots, conserving powder and relying on the others when her arms tired. Along the way, they uncovered fragments of the story of Viego, the ruined king, whose tragic love had transformed an entire kingdom into a realm of death. Sarah listened with a mixture of empathy and horror. She understood the devastation grief could cause, but she also saw the line where mourning turned to madness. Their journey culminated in a confrontation deep within the heart of the Isles. There, in the shattered remains of a palace that once gleamed with gold, the group faced manifestations of the ruined king's will. Shadows coalesced into forms that mirrored their own fears. Viego himself, a towering figure clad in spectral armor, appeared like a sorrowful storm. He spoke of loss and obsession, of refusing to accept the finality of death. Misfortune met his gaze and saw not a monster, but a cautionary reflection of what she might have become had she allowed her own grief to consume her completely. Together with her companions, she fought not just with guns and steel, but with resolve. Each hero's strength complemented the others, and in the end, they disrupted the ritual that would have unleashed an even greater flood of darkness. The ruined king's ambitions were thwarted, at least for a time, and the black mist receded. When Misfortune returned to Bilgewater after the trials on the Shadow Isles, she did so with a deeper understanding of the forces that threatened her home. The journey had expanded her horizons beyond the harbor's edge. She had seen the ruins of ancient kingdoms, the remnants of love twisted into bitterness, and the resilience of unlikely allies. She carried back to her city not just stories, but a renewed sense of purpose. Bilgewater needed stability and leadership, but it also needed to be connected to the broader world and its currents. The dangers outside its cliffs could not be ignored. Her people greeted her with cheers when she stepped onto the docks, but she did not linger in celebration. There were repairs to oversee, treaties to reaffirm, and systems to strengthen. She met with captains and traders, encouraging them to fortify their ships against future harrowings and to share information about unusual tides or dark sightings. She visited the temples, offering coin to priests and priestesses so they could aid those still haunted by nightmares. She sat with orphans and told them stories of heroes who faced fear and triumphed, not to glorify violence, but to kindle hope. In all these interactions, she was calm and measured, her voice a steady anchor amid the swirling life of the port city. At night, when duties allowed, Sarah would walk alone along the cliffs overlooking the sea. The wind whipped at her coat, and the stars stretched above like scattered lanterns. She would unclasp her pistols and hold them, feeling the engravings her mother had etched long ago. She would run her thumb over the coral pendant warmed by her skin and think of the path she had walked. The woman she was now bore little resemblance to the girl in the forge, yet the core of love and resilience remained. Her leadership was not born of arrogance, but of a quiet commitment to protect and guide. She knew that Bilgewater's future would hold more storms, both literal and figurative, but she also knew that with steady hands and an open heart, she could navigate whatever came. And so, sleepy summoner, our story begins to settle like evening mist over calm water. Sarah Fortune's life has been a journey of flames and tides, vengeance and growth. She has walked through smoke and shadow, but she has also stood in the light of dawn with friends at her side. Along the way, she learned that hatred can fuel a fire, but compassion can sustain a hearth. She discovered that leadership is a long voyage requiring patience and courage, and that while revenge may avenge a wrong, only healing can restore what was broken within. As you drift towards sleep, imagine the harbor quiet after a long day. Lanterns sway gently, casting soft pools of light on the still water. Somewhere a ship creaks in the tide, and distant laughter from a tavern fades into the night. Sarah sits on the deck of the Siren, polishing her pistols with care. She looks up at the stars, and though her face carries the traces of sorrow and battle, her eyes are steady and warm. She knows the sea will always bring new challenges, but she also knows that she is no longer alone in facing them. In the rhythm of the waves and the whisper of the wind, there is peace. Let that peace carry you into your dreams, cradled by the knowledge that even in a world of danger, kindness and resilience endure. Abigail Fortune's forge was a place of alchemy, not of lead into gold, but of raw metal into instruments of both beauty and danger. Sarah could lose herself for hours, watching her mother transform dark ingots into gleaming components. In the gentle rhythm of those tasks, there was a meditation, a patience that life in Bilgewater rarely afforded. Abigail began by selecting the right metal, examining bars of iron and steel for impurities by sight and sound. She had Sarah hold one end of the bar while she tapped it, teaching her to listen for the clear ring that meant strength and to feel the subtle vibrations that betrayed weaknesses. A weapon is only as good as the material it comes from, she would say, her voice soft over the hiss of the quenching tub. Never rush the foundation. Once the metal was chosen, Abigail set about heating it. The forge's coals glowed like the heart of a volcano, and Sarah marveled at how her mother could reach into that inferno with iron tongs and bring forth molten red pieces with unerring confidence. Sparks flew in bright arcs as Abigail hammered the glowing bars on the anvil, shaping them into rods and plates. The sound filled the workshop, resonating in Sarah's bones. Between each blow, Abigail would explain what she was doing, why she drew the metal out in long pulls for strength, why she curled the end of a trigger guard with careful taps, why she quenched some pieces in oil to temper them while allowing others to cool slowly for elasticity. Sarah learned that every curve of a pistol had a reason, and that understanding those reasons was as important as the force applied to the steel. After the rough shapes were forged, came the precision work. Abigail would clamp the pieces in a vise and file them by hand, smoothing rough edges and refining details. She invited Sarah to sit beside her with her own file, giving her small screws and pins to practice on. Sarah's tongue would poke out in concentration as she drew the file in long, even strokes, feeling the texture of the metal change under her fingertips. Abigail corrected her grip gently, reminding her not to rush, praising her when she achieved the right angle. These lessons taught Sarah more than technique. They taught her patience and pride. There were no shortcuts to excellence. Each component had to fit perfectly with the next, or the entire mechanism would fail. Finally, there was assembly. Pieces that had lived separately on the workbench came together into something greater. Abigail spread them out on a clean cloth, arranging them like parts of a puzzle, then began to slot them together. The lock plate married to the barrel, the trigger slid into its housing, the springs and pins seated with delicate taps. Throughout the process, Abigail explained the dance of each part inside the finished pistol. Sarah saw the interplay of forces, the hammer striking the flint to shower sparks onto powder, the build-up of pressure that propelled the shot, the return of moving pieces to their starting positions. When the pistol was complete, Abigail would test it, not by firing into a crowd of cheering men as some gunsmiths did, but by walking to the edge of the beach and aiming at a distant rock. She would let Sarah feel the recoil against her shoulder and watch the puff of sand where the shot struck. Every shot, she reminded her daughter, marked the culmination of dozens of careful decisions. Those lessons shaped Sarah's philosophy as surely as the heat shaped the metal. She would later apply them to strategies and alliances with equal precision. Beyond technique, Abigail taught values. She made Sarah promise to use weapons only when necessary and to respect those who had none. She told her stories of pirates who died because they boasted rather than planned, and of captains who survived by thinking 2 steps ahead. She spoke of consequences, of how a single misfired shot could change lives. These conversations were gentle but firm, delivered while hands were busy, but minds attentive. In them, Abigail planted seeds of empathy alongside seeds of steel. The memory of her mother's patient instruction would become a touchstone for Sarah when the chaos of Bilgewater threatened to erode her judgment. In the forge, she had learned not just how to build a weapon, but how to build a life defined by craft, purpose, and restraint. On rare days when the forge was quiet and the weather fair, Sarah's father would take her into the nearest larger market. These trips were adventures framed by the mundane. They began with rowing across a stretch of shimmering water in a small dinghy, the oars dipping rhythmically and leaving trails in their wake. Sarah loved the way sunlight danced on the ripples and how the smell of the sea changed as they approached the market, less of salt and more of spices, cooked meats and tar. Her father would tie up the boat and lift her onto the dock, his hands steady and sure. Though his role in the family business was often in the background, these excursions were his domain, and he took pride in teaching Sarah how to navigate them. The market was a riot of color and sound. Banners fluttered between poles, painted with symbols that advertised everything from fresh fruit to ship repairs. Vendors called out their wares in a dozen dialects, voices overlapping in a tapestry of offers and bargains. Sarah's father would greet many of them by name, asking after their families or commenting on recent catches. He taught Sarah how to tell when fish were truly fresh by checking for clear eyes and firm flesh, and how to determine if cloth was worth its price by feeling its weight between thumb and forefinger. When Sarah's eyes lingered on a tray of candied nuts or a string of glass beads, he would laugh and shake his head, reminding her gently that coins had to stretch far when running a forge. But occasionally he would buy her a small treat, placing it quietly into her hand as if it were a secret between them. Amid the bustle, her father also taught lessons in people. He pointed out the subtle cues that indicated whether a person was lying or speaking truth. "See that sailor there," he would whisper, nodding toward a man gesturing wildly with a bottle. "Notice how his eyes dart when he mentions the size of his catch. He exaggerates. Watch for people whose hands are too still when they talk. They're hiding something." These observations were not cynical, but practical. He wanted Sarah to see beyond words, to trust her instincts and the evidence of her senses. He also showed her acts of generosity, like the baker who gave an extra roll to a hungry child, or the cloth merchant who nodded solemnly at the shrine of the bearded lady. "Remember," he said, "Bilgewater is rough, but it's still full of folks doing the best they can." The day often ended with them sitting on a pier, sharing a simple lunch of bread and cheese while watching ships come and go. Sarah would lean against her father's shoulder, feeling his warmth and listening to his stories about his youth before he met Abigail. Those memories, filled with the smell of market spices and the sound of gulls, became a reservoir of gentleness she would draw upon when the world seemed only harsh. Misfortune's path to vengeance was strewn with the bodies of those who stood in her way, but not every hunt ended with a bullet. Some ended with mercy, and in those moments Sarah glimpsed the complexity of justice. One such hunt led her to Rat Town, a maze of ramshackle buildings and stilt houses built over fetid water. The target was a young man barely older than she had been when her parents were killed. He was accused of ambushing merchants and stealing their goods with a makeshift gang of desperate youths. The bounty on his head promised decent coin, but when Sarah found him cornered in a collapsing boathouse, she saw that his hands shook not from aggression, but from hunger and fear. His gang had scattered at her approach, leaving him alone in the dim, damp space. Sarah leveled her pistols, and he raised his arms, pleading. He spoke of siblings waiting in a leaking shack, of a mother sick with fever. He admitted to the crimes without embellishment, his voice breaking on the admission. Sarah's finger tightened on the trigger, then eased. In that moment she remembered her father lifting her onto a dock, her mother guiding her hand at the anvil, the lessons they had taught about responsibility. Killing him would earn her coin, but it would also leave a family destitute and potentially create more young criminals. She holstered one pistol and lowered the other. Instead of delivering death, she offered him a choice: return the stolen goods, disband his gang, and work for her crew on the docks under supervision. The young man agreed without hesitation. Over time, he proved himself loyal, and his wages sent food and medicine back to his family. Stories like this rarely made it into the songs sung about misfortune, but they were integral to her growth. They showed her that justice in Bilgewater was not a simple ledger of debts paid in blood. Sometimes it was a tangled net of mercy, consequence, and pragmatic compassion. Not all hunts ended so neatly. Sarah once tracked down Ven Galar, a gang leader who had taken advantage of Gangplank's absence to terrorize wharf workers. Galar had built his power by pitting crews against one another with lies and carefully stoked grudges. Sarah infiltrated one of his meetings disguised as a deckhand, listening as he proposed an alliance to consolidate control of the slaughter docks. At the right moment, she threw off her cloak and announced her presence with a warning shot fired into the ceiling. The room erupted in shouts and drawn blades. Galar laughed, convinced his numbers would overwhelm her. But Sarah had not come alone. Her crew burst through the doors behind her, muskets and pistols at the ready. A brief firefight followed, bullets thudding into barrels and shattering bottles. Galar attempted to flee through a side door, but Sarah intercepted him on a narrow catwalk. They fought hand to hand, her pistols useless at such close range. He was strong, but she was faster, and the memory of her parents' deaths lent her strength. She slammed the butt of her gun into his temple, knocking him unconscious. Instead of killing him outright, she dragged him to the harbor and bound him to a post as a warning, his fate left to the people he had oppressed. When dawn came, she learned that someone had cut his bonds and taken him away. Whether it was an act of pity or an act of vengeance, she never knew. Moments like that reminded her that control in Bilgewater was always slipping through her fingers like water, that no victory was ever absolute. Twisted Fate and Malcolm Graves were as different as two thieves could be, yet together they were a formidable pair. Fate was slender and sharp-eyed, his fingers constantly shuffling a deck of cards that flickered between his hands like birds. Graves was broad and solid, his shotgun slung across his back and his beard flecked with pipe ash. They were known in Bilgewater as much for their bickering as for their heists. Misfortune sought them out not for camaraderie, but because she recognized in them a shared disdain for Gangplank and a talent for misdirection. She found them in the Winter's Kiss, a tavern that smelled of spilled ale and old wood, engaged in a heated argument over a half-finished game of cards. Sarah slid into a chair at their table without waiting for an invitation. For a moment, Fate's eyes narrowed, and Graves's hand inched toward his shotgun. Then recognition flickered across their faces, and they settled into wary grins. The conversation that followed was slow and measured. Sarah spoke of the opportunity to strike at Gangplank by targeting his resources and undermining his mystique. Fate leaned back, spinning a card between his fingers, considering the gamble. Graves asked blunt questions about risk and reward, his voice rough but his eyes calculating. Sarah outlined her plan to sabotage the dead pool, emphasizing the public nature of the act and the humiliation it would inflict on their mutual enemy. She did not attempt to flatter them, instead appealing to their hatred of being used by others and their love of dramatic flair. Over mugs of watery ale, they began to craft a scheme that would draw upon each of their strengths. Fate would handle the deception, forging documents and playing the part of a supply officer to gain access to the dead pool. His cards, enchanted with arcane marks, could be used to signal progress or to create distractions by exploding into harmless bursts of light. Graves would secure weapons and explosives, using his contacts among arms dealers to procure blasting powder. His knowledge of explosive charges would ensure that the detonation crippled the ship without destroying the entire harbor. Sarah would coordinate the timing, placing her crew strategically and ensuring that the city's attention was directed away from suspicious activities. They debated logistics, argued over contingencies, and occasionally exchanged barbed comments about competence. Yet beneath the surface prickliness, a shared respect developed. When they finally clinked their mugs together to seal the plan, there was a sense of anticipation in the air. For Fate and Graves, the plot was a thrilling heist. For Sarah, it was the culmination of years of preparation. Together, they wove a story that Bilgewater would never forget. The ship that would become the Siren was originally known as the Siren, a two-masted cutter with sleek lines and a reputation for speed. Its captain was a brash man named Byron, a pirate whose arrogance was tempered only by his fear of gangplank. Barn had grown complacent after years of skirting the edges of the Reaver King's wrath. When Sarah approached him with a proposition to join her cause, he laughed and took it as an affront. "Why should I follow a girl with fancy pistols?" he sneered, leaning against the ship's railing. His crew laughed with him, their hands resting lightly on cutlasses and pistols. Sarah did not respond with bluster. She simply told him he had a choice: sail under her flag and fight for a future without gangplank, or stand aside and watch his world burn. Byron responded by drawing his weapon. The ensuing struggle was swift and decisive. Sarah ducked under his swing and drove her elbow into his ribs, then brought the pommel of her pistol up under his chin. He staggered backward, spitting blood and curses. Barnes' crew hesitated, unsure whether to help their captain or admire the audacity of the stranger. In that pause, Rafen's team, who had been waiting unseen, emerged from the shadows and trained their muskets on the deck. The crew dropped their weapons, recognizing the futility of resistance. Sarah offered Byron one last chance to join her. He refused again, pride blinding him to the shifting winds of Bilgewater. With a sigh, she had him removed from the ship and left on the dock, alive but humiliated. She then addressed the remaining crew. She did not threaten them. Instead, she spoke of freedom from Gangplank's oppressive taxes and arbitrary punishments, of the chance to seize their own destinies. Many of them, having felt the weight of the Reaver King's yoke, agreed. Those who did not were allowed to depart peacefully. Sarah renamed the ship the Siren, a nod to the dangerous allure of the sea, and a reminder that she would use it to draw Gangplank toward his doom. Over the following weeks, she worked alongside her new crew to refit the ship. Together, they scrubbed decks, repaired sails, and reinforced hull planks. As they labored, they shared stories, and Sarah listened. These voices, once part of the machinery of piracy, became part of her own machinery of resistance. By the time the Siren's new flag was hoisted, a stylized pistol over crossed anchors, it flew over a ship transformed not just in name, but in allegiance. In the wake of the dead pool's fiery destruction, captains and gang leaders scrambled to claim pieces of Gangplank's former empire. Dockside taverns that had once been neutral ground turned into battlegrounds of whispers and threats. Misfortune called a meeting in the neutral hall of the Salt Spire, a barn-like structure built on pilings above the water. Its walls were adorned with barnacles and faded banners, and its windows looked out over the harbour, reminding everyone present of what was at stake. The captains arrived guarded and suspicious, each escorted by armed sailors. Vengala came with a face like carved stone, his scars a map of old battles. Travin, leader of the Wharf Kings, lounged as if the room belonged to him, his fingers tapping idly on the hilt of a dagger. Representatives of the Cragside lads and the Boneyard scallies slipped in through side doors, their eyes darting like rats. Sarah stood at the head of a long table made from lashed-together planks. She wore no extravagant jewelry or ostentatious clothing, only her well-worn coat and her pistols. Her hair was tied back, and her expression was calm. As she began to speak, the murmurs faded. She acknowledged their grievances and their ambitions without judgment, laying out the situation plainly. If they continued to fight one another, Bilgewater would become weak and vulnerable to outside threats. Noxian warships would see an easy conquest. Rival pirate clans from the northern seas would swoop in to plunder. She urged them to consider a different path, to carve up territory with agreements rather than blades, to respect neutral zones like markets and shipyards, and to enforce a code that punished unnecessary cruelty. It was not a utopian vision, it was pragmatic survival. The negotiations were tense. Vengala argued that he should control the slaughter docks because his family had once owned the land before Gangplank took it. Travin scoffed and claimed he had kept order in Rat Town when no one else dared. Accusations flew across the table. Betrayals, thefts, old insults resurrected and polished. Sarah listened, intervening when tempers flared dangerously. She reminded them that their quarrels served no one but the memories of a dead tyrant. Gradually, the captains began to see the sense in her words. Agreements were hammered out with muttered curses and reluctant handshakes. Boundaries were drawn on a crude map spread across the table, lines marking which gang could collect which taxes and where weapons could not be drawn. Sarah insisted on establishing communal funds to repair docks and support families affected by the recent violence. Some balked at the idea, but she held firm, pointing out that a city in flames benefited no one. When the meeting finally ended, it was with no love lost among the participants, but with a fragile consensus. They left the Salt Spire under watchful eyes, understanding that if they failed to uphold their end of the bargain, misfortune would hold them to account. When the black mist rolled in that fateful night, it was not like any fog Sarah had ever seen. It moved with intent, coiling around hulls and sliding between buildings, its edges lit with an unholy green glow. The temperature dropped so suddenly that breath came in clouds, and a thick layer of frost formed on ropes and decks. The air smelled of stagnant water and old tombs. As Sarah led her crew through the streets toward the docks, her boots left prints that glittered with a rime of ice. Above them, the sky was a roiling mass of dark clouds, shot through with occasional flashes of sickly green lightning. The first wave of spirits emerged silently, gliding out of the fog with gaping mouths and clawed hands. They seemed almost curious at first, their empty eyes flicking over Sarah and her companions, but that curiosity quickly gave way to hunger. Misfortune raised her pistols and fired, each shot a bloom of orange light in the grey gloom. Her bullets tore through the ghostly forms, dispersing them into shimmering motes. But more came, crawling along the sides of ships and rising from the water. Raven's men lit their clay bombs, hurling them into clusters of spirits. The bombs exploded with a sound like thunder, briefly pushing back the mist. Flames flickered along the docks, reflecting in pools of water that had turned slick with ice. Nearby, The giant Freljordian warrior Olaf roared and swung his axe, the true ice blade cleaving spectral warriors with terrifying precision. Ilaoi slammed her idol into the ground, calling upon Nagakaburos, and spectral tentacles erupted from the planks to smash wraiths back into the sea. Sarah moved with practiced grace, loading and firing, dodging ethereal claws, and directing her fighters. The weight of the coral pendant was a steady pressure against her chest, a reminder to keep moving. She saw fear in her crew's eyes, but she also saw determination. When a spectre in the shape of a drowned sailor seized Ithaca's arm, Sarah stepped in, firing point blank into the creature's chest and pulling her comrade free. She barked encouragement over the cacophony, her voice firm but not harsh. Through the relentless assault, she began to sense patterns in the enemy's movements, times when the mist pulsed, drawing breath before exhaling another horde. She adjusted her strategy accordingly, ordering her crew to conserve ammunition during the lulls and to strike hard when the tide surged. Hours felt like days. Fingers went numb from the cold, and muscles burned from exhaustion. Sarah's ears rang from the constant reports of guns and the screams of both the living and the dead. At one point, a towering figure appeared through the fog, a dread knight, its horse fused to its body, wielding a flaming scythe. It charged down the dock, scattering fighters. Misfortune met it with a calm born from countless battles. She fired both pistols at its chest, the shots punching through and making it stagger. As it raised its scythe, she rolled beneath its swing, the blade passing harmlessly overhead. Behind her, Rafen hurled a bomb that detonated beneath the creature's belly, engulfing it in light and sending it careening into the water. It screamed as it dissolved, its cry echoing from the surrounding cliffs. As dawn approached, the mist thinned, the spirit's attacks faltered, and a pale light spread across the harbour. Sarah's arms trembled, the pistols heavy in her hands. Around her, fighters leaned on muskets or sat hard on the icy planks, chests heaving. The water was littered with debris and strange ice-like crystals that evaporated in the early light. The black mist retreated, streaming back toward the horizon like smoke drawn by a giant's breath. The silence that followed was thick, punctuated by the creak of strained timber and the distant sobbing of those who had lost loved ones. Sarah holstered her guns and closed her eyes for a moment, letting the dawn's fragile warmth wash over her. The fight had been terrifying, but in that terror a new bond had been forged among her crew and the people of Bilgewater. They had stood together against the unknown, and together they had survived. That unity would become a cornerstone of the city's resilience in the trials ahead. The voyage to the Shadow Isles was a test of endurance and trust. The assembled heroes, Misfortune, Ilaoi, Braum, Yasuo, Ari, Pike, boarded a sturdy schooner provisioned for a journey into darkness. As the ship pulled away from Bilgewater's cliffs, Sarah stood at the stern, watching the city shrink to a collection of silhouettes and then disappear beneath the horizon. She felt a pang of uncertainty. Leaving her city under the care of others was uncomfortable, but she reminded herself that sometimes one must step away to protect what one loves. The open ocean stretched before them, dark and seemingly endless. Waves whispered secrets against the hull, and the wind carried the scent of rain and distant lands. The travellers filled the days with work and conversation. Braum told tales of the Freljor, of frost giants and hearth-bound rituals, his booming laughter warming the hearts of those who listened. He also took it upon himself to cook for the crew, concocting hearty stews that filled bellies and lifted spirits. Ilaoi led daily exercises on deck, insisting that strong bodies made for strong spirits. Her encouragement was as potent as the weight she swung with ease. Pike kept mostly to himself, sharpening his harpoon's wicked tip and muttering to unseen voices. Occasionally he would vanish, then return dripping wet, claiming he needed to commune with the ocean's depths. Ari drifted between groups, sometimes laughing at Brown's jokes, sometimes perched high in the rigging, watching the horizon with alert amber eyes. She kept a small pouch of charms and herbs, which she used to perform quiet rituals that she claimed would ward off malevolent spirits. Yasuo, perhaps the most taciturn of the group, spent hours each day at the bow, his hands on the hilt of his sword, his gaze distant. In the evenings, when the sun dipped and the sky flamed with hues of orange and purple, he would play his flute. The music was haunting, lilting between sorrow and hope. Misfortune found herself drawn to those moments. She would sit on a coil of rope, cleaning her pistols as the notes washed over her. Sometimes the melody stirred memories of her father humming in the forge, or of nights spent listening to sailors' songs drifting from taverns. At other times it conjured images of battles fought and friends lost, a bittersweet reminder of the cost of her journey. The music also connected the disparate heroes, weaving a thread of shared humanity through their varied backgrounds. The deeper they sailed into the ocean, the stranger the surroundings became. The sky grew heavier and the water darkened, reflecting no stars. Phosphorescent algae clung to the hull, casting an eerie green glow that mirrored the color of the black mist. Whispers rose with the wind, sometimes sounding like voices calling from far away, sometimes like cries of warning. Ari warned everyone not to answer, believing they were meant to lure the living overboard. One night, a thick fog enveloped the ship, and figures appeared in the mist, the ghostly forms of sailors lost in previous voyages. They reached out imploringly, their expressions twisted by despair. Ilaoi stood at the prow, brandishing her idol and chanting prayers that reverberated like drum beats. The apparitions faded with the fog, leaving behind only the memory of their hollow eyes. Experiences like this bonded the group in ways no tavern conversation could. They relied on one another, not just for physical protection, but for moral strength. During calmer days, Sarah spoke with Ilaoi about leadership and faith. The priestess's philosophy of motion resonated with her. Ilaoi believed that individuals were most alive when they moved toward their purpose, no matter how uncertain the path. Stagnation, she said, invited decay and ruin. Sarah thought of how revenge had once held her like an anchor, and how taking on the mantle of leadership had set her in motion again. She realized that this voyage was another form of movement, one that would carry her beyond her previous horizons. At night, she lay in her small berth and listened to the creak of timbers and the whisper of water against hull, letting their rhythms lull her toward rest, even as her mind churned with plans for what lay ahead. Deep in the heart of the Shadow Isles, the group reached the ruined palace where the ruined king's power was centered. The air there was thick with despair, each breath feeling like it passed through cobwebs of sorrow. The palace had once been a place of splendor, its arches soaring and its halls echoing with laughter, but now it lay in decay, its stone slick with moss, its windows shattered. Veils of mist drifted through doorways, carrying whispers that tugged at sanity. Shadows clung to corners and seemed to watch the intruders with malevolent curiosity. As Sarah stepped onto the cracked tiles of the palace floor, she felt the weight of history pressing down on her shoulders. Viego's presence manifested as a chilling wind that coiled around them, carrying with it the scent of wilted roses and grave earth. He appeared slowly, first as an outline, then as a towering figure of dark metal and ghostly flesh. His eyes were vacant yet burning, his face simultaneously regal and unmoored. In his hand he carried a sword that pulsed with mournful energy. He did not attack immediately. Instead, he spoke, his voice like a chorus of overlapping murmurs. He told them of a love that death had stolen, of a heart that could not accept loss, of a nation dragged into ruin because a king refused to let go. His words were both a confession and an accusation. He saw in each of them reflections of his own grief and dared them to condemn him for acting on what they themselves had felt. The battle that followed was unlike any misfortune had fought. She could not simply shoot Viego. Bullets passed through him as if through smoke, dissipating and then coalescing again. Instead, the fight became an exercise in resilience and timing. Eloi called upon her deity, summoning massive spectral tentacles that slammed into the ruined king and disrupted his form. Braum stood as a living shield, intercepting waves of dark energy that Viego flung toward them. Yasuo dashed through the battlefield with the speed of wind, his sword slicing through tendrils of magic that sought to ensnare them. Ari hurled orbs of foxfire and charmed lesser spirits into fighting on their behalf. Pike darted in and out of shadows, stabbing at points where Viego seemed most solid, his harpoon glowing with borrowed life. Sarah took a different role. She focused on the sources of Viego's power, vessels of black mist anchored around the chamber. These swirling crystals fed him energy and had to be destroyed. She sprinted from cover to cover, dodging arcs of spectral energy. Her pistols blazed, bullets chipping away at the misty anchors. Each time one shattered, Viego roared, and the chamber shook as if struck by an earthquake. He turned his attention to her, raising his sword to direct a beam of concentrated sorrow in her direction. The air chilled, and Sarah's breath crystallized. She could feel the pull of his anguish, like hands wrapping around her heart, whispering lies about her parents dying because of her failure. She gritted her teeth and thought of the forge's warmth, of Rafen's loyalty, of the children she had saved in Bilgewater. She squeezed the trigger and fired, not at the king, but at another anchor. It exploded in a flare of green light, and Viego staggered. The battle raged on, each member of the group pushing beyond exhaustion. At last, with the final anchor destroyed, Viego's form flickered wildly. Eloi's idol crashed down upon him. Braum's shield slammed into his chest, and Yasuo's blade cut through his core. Ari's magic wrapped around him like a net of stars, and Pike's harpoon pierced his shadow. In that moment, Sarah's pistols flared once more. The bullets were like twin comets, striking the ruined king's heart and releasing a burst of light. Viego screamed, a sound of boundless loss, and then his body dissolved into mist. The energy he had gathered dispersed, and the oppressive weight in the air lifted. The black mist that hovered outside the palace receded, drawn back toward the sea. When the silence settled, the group stood among fallen debris and fading echoes. They were bruised, their clothes torn, their eyes rimmed with exhaustion. But They were alive. Sarah leaned against a pillar, her breathing ragged, her pistol smoking. She looked around at her companions and felt a surge of gratitude. They had come from different corners of the world, each with their own reasons. Yet they had stood together against a force that could have drowned them all. In Viego's folly, she saw a reflection
Minions
of her own
have spawned.
Watch your mouth,
potential
kid,
path,
or you'll find yourself
and felt
respawning
a
at
cautious
home.
relief that she had chosen differently. The palace around them was in ruin, but within something created something, a trust in others, and a belief that even the deepest wounds could begin to heal when faced with understanding and courage. Life aboard the Siren settled into rhythms that resembled the sea itself. Calm on some days, tumultuous on others. Sarah learned that leadership was as much about navigating routine as it was about confronting crises. Dawn aboard the ship was heralded by the soft whistle of the wind and the gentle slap of water. Sailors rose from their hammocks and rolled up blankets, stretching stiff muscles and rubbing sleep. Ithaca oversaw the morning inventory, counting powder and shot, mending frayed ropes and sharpening blades. She carried something when she got the musket fire and every nail hammer. Her neat script a reflection of her orderly life. Breakfast was simple, hardtack softened in stew or dried fish rehydrated in broth, but the crew accepted it without rating negotiations was a surprisingly good cook when it he added herbs he collected from barking stones and bits of dried fruit to liven up the food. After eating, sailors took notice. Some just sailors, their bare feet gripping rope and wood, their bodies swaying the ship. Others scrubbed decks, their brushes rhythmically sweeping across backs, all smoothed by countless boots. The work was physically demanding, but there was solace in predictability. Misfortune moved within her crew, offering advice where needed, lending a hand with a knot here or a barrel there, and listening to their complaints and jokes. Her presence was not distant or aloof. She shared in their labor, which fostered respect far more than barked orders ever could. During long passages, when the ocean stretched empty in all directions, Sarah encouraged camaraderie to keep minds sharp and spirits high. Evenings were reserved for storytelling and song. One crew member would pull out a battle violin, and another would drum a rhythm on an upturned barrel. Voices rose in harmony, singing shanties about epic patches, lost loves, and monstrous sea creatures. Sarah listened and sometimes joined in, her voice blending with the others. Through these shared moments, she learned the names of their siblings, the towns they hailed from, the dreams they carried like small treasures. She discovered that one sailor had once been a tribesman like her mother, lost to the sea by debt. Another had fled conscription and martyrdom. Each story deepened her understanding of the human tapestry aboard her ship. Stormy days tested the crew's cohesion. When dark clouds gathered and waves swelled, the deck tilted dangerously. Rain stung faces and wind whipped hair into eyes. Orders had to be shouted above the roar of the sea. Cut through the noise. Reef the sails, she was called, and the crew responded with efficient movements. They trusted her not just because she carried pistols, but because she knew their names and shared their hardships. In the worst of storms, when life was split the sky and the world seemed reduced to a slow, bucking deck amid endless gray. Sarah would secure herself to the helm with a length of rope and steer, feeling the pull of the rudder through her arms. She whispered to the sea, not in supplication, but in acknowledgement. She respected its power and accepted its It was in these ordinary days that the bonds of the crew strengthened most. Battles forged sudden camaraderie, but routine wove a lasting net. Sarah came to see that the Siren was more than a vessel. It was a home. Its timbers creaked with familiarity, its sails snapped with pride. The ship carried not only guns and powder, but also hopes and memories. The men and women who lived did so with the quiet confidence that comes from belonging. For Sarah, who had lost her first home to fire and violence, the Siren's companionship offered a healing she had not anticipated. It reminded her that her home could be rebuilt, plank by plank, heart by heart, on the open sea. There were nights when sleep did not come easily to Sarah, when the ghosts of the past and the uncertainties of the future tumbled together in her mind. On one such night, she sat alone on the deck under a canopy of stars. The sea was calm, with constellations and jewels scattered on the velvet waves. A soft breeze carried a faint scent of lavender from sachets hung and rigging to ward off insects. She closed her eyes and let the rhythmic rocking of the ship lull her into a meditative state. Gradually, her thoughts drifted, and she found herself in a space between wakefulness and dreams. In this dreamscape, she walked along the beach, reminiscent of her childhood island, though the sand glittered like powdered silver. Ahead of her stood two figures, her mother and her father. They were, as she remembered, their faces gently moving, their hands still on their faces. Though the sight of them filled her with both joy and sorrow, she felt no tears. Abigail reached out and placed a hand over Sarah's heart, her palm warm and steady. "We are proud of you," she said, her voice echoing faintly as if carried carried our life and our teachings into places we never dreamed of. Her father nodded, his eyes crinkling. "You have avenged," he said softly, "but you have also protected others. You are so strong. Ask how to navigate the crossroads she faced. Her voice did not come in the dream. Instead, she listened as the wind rose and carried whispers around her. Some whispers spoke of satisfaction of seeing those who wronged her fault. Other whispers spoke of mercy, understanding the desperation that drove people to dark deeds. The voices swirled like currents, tugging her in different directions. She remembered the young man in Rattown whose life she had spared, and the relief in his eyes. She remembered the rage that had fueled her when she burned Gangplank's ship. In a dream, her mother's hand over her heart seemed to steady those conflicting tides. Abigail spoke again. "Every choice leaves ripples. You cannot control all of them, but you can choose the direction of your own steps. Let empathy temper justice, but do not let fear of missteps paralyze you." Sarah awoke with a start, the stars still above her.
Blue team's turret has been destroyed.
Like the taste of salt on her lips. It did not provide clear answers, but it offered comfort. She understood that her parents would not judge her for mistakes or for mercy. They cared only that she acted with sincerity and courage. The next morning, as she cleaned her pistols, she pondered the dream's meaning. She realized that while vengeance had given her purpose, mercy gave her the capacity to build something better. In a place like Bilgewater, where sharp edges were the norm, choosing compassion was incompatible with rebellion. From that day forward, she strove to weigh each decision not only against her desire for retribution, but also against its impact on the world around her. The dream became a secret well she could draw from when the burden of choice felt heavy, a place she could revisit sleepless nights to remember that life did not end with death and that forgiveness could coexist with justice. During a lull between storms and battles, Illaoi invited Sarah to join her in meditation on the siren's death. The priestess sat cross-legged with her idol cradled in her lap, her gaze fixed on the horizon. Method, power, and strategy, not in unseen gods, but the pendant at her throat and the recent brush of the supernatural had opened her to the possibility that there were powers beyond her comprehension. She sat opposite Illaoi, mirroring her posture, the gentle sway of the ship Then Illaoi spoke, as deep as the ocean. You move like a warrior.
Step right up! Look out!
Sarah frowned slightly, processing the words. Surrender, she echoed quietly, feeling a flash of resistance. Illaoi smiled, sensing not surrender but surrender of the need to control every wave. There are currents in life that you can guide, and others you must ride. Endurance. Sarah considered this. She had built her success on control of her pistols, of her plans, of her crew. The idea of releasing some of that control unsettled.
Step right up!
How do I know? Illaoi closed her eyes, then opened them again. Not just to your own anger or to
Blue
the
team
tears of
double kill.
but to the whispers beneath both. When you confronted
Red
them,
team's turret has been destroyed.
followed a current. When you chose to step that falling when the black mist attacked, you could have hidden, but you moved toward the fight. You took responsibility. Leadership is moving in harmony with these currents, not forcing them. It is choosing and inviting others to join you. Respect for ours, touching on the nature of faith and leadership. Illaoi shared stories of her own journeys, of times she had defied her goddess and faced consequences, and of times she had been surprised by where obedience led her. She spoke of the land of her dreams, not as a reality, but as a force that lived in every breath and heartbeat, in every decision to move forward. Sarah listened, occasionally interjecting with her own experiences. She confessed her fears of becoming the very tyrant she had overthrown, of losing herself in power. Illaoi nodded, acknowledging the validity of those fears. Fear can be a guide, she said. It can remind you to seek counsel. those who hoarded, not those who ruled themselves. Conversation left us much
Red team's turret has been destroyed.
moment, nor did she fully embrace Nagakaburos, but she came away with a deeper appreciation for the philosophy of motion. She began to see her own actions as part of a larger weave, each choice connected to countless others. The conversation within her became another anchor, a reminder that she was neither alone nor solely responsible for every wave, but a larger sea of lives moving together. Bilgewater was a city of contradictions. Peril and celebration walked hand in hand on the streets. For all its reputation for cutthroat dealings and treacherous waters, it was also a place where life was embraced with gusto. Misfortune discovered that understanding these rhythms was as crucial to travel as any strategy. One such rhythm was the Leviathan. Once a year, during the high tide of the sea, great Leviathans were driven toward the slaughter docks by crews of skilled hunters. The beasts, larger than motor ships, crew members scrambled over slick flanks, securing ropes and using special priests blessed beasts, thanking for their sacrifice. Children perched on the battles,
Red team's turret has been destroyed.
tails thrashing in the water.
Blue team has slain
Sarah
the dragon.
watched from a raised platform, her stomach churning with eyes. She had seen worse, but at the scale, she saw faces lit with excitement and pride, understanding that the harvest would provide oil for lamps, meat for stew, and bones for tools. The Leviathan harvest was both brutal and life-sustaining, a physical manifestation of Bilgewater's philosophy. To thrive, one must embrace the ground. Another night marked on Bilgewater's calendar was the Gambler's Moon, a festival held under the year's largest full moon. On this night, taverns opened their doors wide, and tables spilled out into streets festooned with lanterns. Card games, ice creams, and contests of skill flourished. Gold and silver changed hands in noisy exchanges, laughter mingling with curses as fortunes were won and lost. Musicians roamed between tables, drums rising timber. Vendors sold skewers of spiced meat and cups of This virtue, ever strategic, urged these knights to gather information. People loosened their tongues when gambling, and secrets slipped out of the signs of those of sometimes she saw hardened criminals sharing jokes with dock workers, and nobles disguised in plain clothes tasting food. The festival reminded people that even those who lived by the sword sought moments of lightness. Then there were quieter celebrations, like the lantern floating, held on the night honoring lost sailors, families, and friends, crafted small lanterns out of oiled paper and driftwood. As dusk fell, they lit candles inside the lanterns and whispered the names of loved ones before placing them in the water. Thousands of lights bobbed on the waves, drifting out toward the open sea. The sight was breathtaking. A river of stars moved across the sky. Sarah was the mountain floating after taking control of Bilgewater. She two small lanterns, inscribing one with her mother's name and the other with her father's. The ceremony was a release, a way for Bilgewater to acknowledge its losses and to send love into the unknown. Standing there, lantern light reflecting in her eyes, Sarah felt connected to the city she by engaging with these festivals and traditions, Sarah earned trust that the listen to as much
Triple kill.
joy as in sorrow. Bilgewater's culture was messy and loud. Misfortune anchored her leadership in more than her pistols. She anchored it in the shared experiences that bound the city together. Defeating the ruled king taught misfortune that isolation was. When she returned to Bilgewater, she began she sent envoys to the foreign, carrying messages. Along with warriors seeking a warmer place to spend their winters in exchange for the access to the Ionian elves and satyrs soon mingled with Bilgewater's town, and in return, Bilgewater's traders respected the customs of their ports. These exchanges were not purely economic. And interdependence. Sarah also expanded information through artificial channels. Though the kingdom's rigid hierarchy and dislike of diplomacies made official diplomacy difficult, there were groups within the Larcher interested in trade and studying shipbuilding techniques. Misfortune was cautious, knowing the Martian law did not look kindly on pirates. Some options were rebuffed, but others found purchase among the Martians who understood that the world was changing and that even power was needed allies. Perhaps reached out to the mountains, a tribe of seafolk who lived in hidden coral
Red
cities.
team's turret has been destroyed.
Mariah had long avoided contact with surface people, but Lowry's influence and scientists the ocean one
Red team's turret has been destroyed.
knowledge of tides and currents that had saved buildings.
Red team's turret has been destroyed. Blue team triple kill.
These agreements were reinforced
Double kill. Red team's turret has been
A summoner has disconnected. A summoner has disconnected.
and gunmaking. Sarah oversaw these relationships with the same care she used in building her crew. She appointed
Minions have
diplomats who had
spawned.
grown up on Bilgewater's docks but possessed the patience to sit through Ionia's long ceremonies and the nerve to negotiate with frail Jordian shield maidens. She hosted visiting dignitaries on the Siren, showing them the harbor and explaining the city's history. In doing so, she framed Bilgewater not as a vibrant, self-sustaining city with much to offer. The alliances did not make Bilgewater gentle. It remained rough and dangerous, but they wove it into the fabric of the world. Sarah took satisfaction in this expansion, seeing her people. The sea might separate lands, but careful navigation led us connected. As the years rolled on, misfortune settled in our favor. Frantic pace of vengeance or the desperate defense against supernatural horrors, but by surely Bilgewater's future would be brighter than its past. That she would not always be able to stand in front of every man, pistons blazing, time and experience, as well as the scars that mapped her, made her efficient in cultivating new knowledge and passing on lessons learned in hard. In the early mornings, when the harbor was painted in hues of blue and pink, she could often be found in a section of dock with a young girl standing beside her. The girl's name was Mary, a child mixed heritage with storm clouds and hair with shell.
First
Sailor
blood.
lost to the harrowing, and her mother ran the storm. The girl possessed and determination reminded Sarah of her younger sister. Their trade began with the balance is not just about how you hold a gun. It's about yourself. Ground practice hours firing at makeshift targets set up against the barnacle pilings, the sound of shots echoing off water and wind. Sometimes Mara hit her mark clean. Other times, her shots flew. Each time, Sarah would offer constructive criticism, never harsh, always honest. She remembered her mother's patient teaching and passing on not just technique, but between drills, Mara asked about the world beyond the field. The Jordian gardens, the Ionian blossoms, and sea. Sarah responded in ways that balanced adventure and caution, leaving morals of and empathy. They walked through crowded markets, and Sarah pointed out the currents of power. How a small Northern fishmonger to a Canadian tenant could signal truce, or how a slight change in the quality of goods in a store could indicate an upcoming shortage. She spoke of the importance of alliances, recounting how shadow plans and the importance of working alongside occasionally, she would challenge someone, asking why she spent one time but not another. These questions forced Sarah to articulate her internal compass, to explain that mercy was not weakness, and that sometimes justice was she answers in decisions she had made long ago. One afternoon, after a practice session in which the sun beat down vigorously and sweat dripped from her temples, Mara sat cross-legged on the dock. Sarah sat listening. The wood warmed. A cool breeze picked up, carrying with it the scent of faraway rain. "Captain," Mara asked, using the time, "do you ever you chose?" The question hung between them, heavy but not accusatory. Sarah gazed out of the water, watching the dolphins skim the surface. She thought of the fire in her heart, the many lives she had taken to spare.
Never hope.
Lives. Voices of those who shot and wondered what their lives I choose you, she asked. A soft tone was there, warmth and sadness. "You will," she said. "We all do. It's what you do that matters. Will you hide from your mistake, or will you face it, make amends, and move forward?" Sharing it, she hoped to ease the girl's journey. As Mara
Shut down.
mediating minor
Red team
disputes
double
at
kill.
the docks. Each mission was an opportunity for Mara to apply what she had learned. Under Sarah's watchful eye, the girl learned to read body language, to refuse tension with humor or firm look, and to draw the weapon only as a last resort. When they returned to the silent after successful actions, the crew cheered Mara's progress, treating her not as a child, but as a future. The camaraderie of the ship wrapped around her like a cloak, reinforcing the sense of belonging Sarah had worked so hard to build. Nicknames based on her most recent exploits. Quick shot when she hit the bottle floating in the harbour. Silver tongue, which commanded 2 sailors to settle the bet without fists. These nicknames were badges of honour Mara wore with pride. Sarah also encouraged Mara to pursue interest beyond combat. She introduced her to the forge, now rebuilt in Bilgewater proper, a space filled with new tools and staffed by apprentices who had studied under masters in Bilgewater and Zalm. The forge's glow was softer than the one Sarah remembered from her childhood, filtered through upgraded chimneys and tempered by knowledge of safety. The smell of metal and oil still stirred something deep within her. Mara's eyes widened at the sight of sparks and the sound of hammers. Under the guidance of a blacksmith named Shadow, a former miner tree trunks and Mara learned to shape nails and horns, learned to file small figures, and supervision to assess
Never hope.
process demanded patience and precision. You can build it, Sarah said. Working in the forge to the practical heart of Bilgewater. It was a reminder of the city, not only on the daily raids, but also on craftsmanship and labour. As seasons turned and Sarah's hair grew longer and her aim grew, Bilgewater itself continued to evolve. Uneasy truce among gangs held, strengthened by shared challenges and the external alliances Sarah fostered. New businesses sprang up on the docks, bringing goods and stories from distant lands. The Shadow Isles remained a constant threat on the horizon, but with each harrowing, Bilgewater's defenses improved, guided by the knowledge and courage of those who had faced the mist before. Sarah's hair had streaks of silver, and lines appeared around her eyes. She spent more time strategizing than shooting, trusting her trained commanders to carry out orders in the field. On nights, when the sea was especially calm, she would take out Sarah's pistols, now cared for by careful hands and used less frequently, and polished until they shone. And of the journey that began with the forge and led to the depths where she sat. In those reflective moments, Sarah considered her legacy. Instead, she measured her impact. Who now collaborated on community projects, like the children who ran through the fire, still caught in crossfire by the side of her, helping younger generations learn she knew that Bilgewater What now? Lara asks. Silence, the waves whispering promises of continued journeys, their hearts steady, their